Johnny Cash was a man of contradictions, both a devout believer and a restless sinner, a loving husband and a reckless wanderer. He was a voice for the outcasts, yet he battled demons that nearly destroyed him. Behind the legend of the Man in Black lies a story far more complex than the songs that made him famous. A life marked by passion and pain, triumph and tragedy. He sang of devotion while struggling with infidelity, preached redemption while drowning in addiction, and stood against authority while battling his own self-destruction. This is the untold story of Johnny Cash, the heartbreak, the scandal, and the relentless pursuit of redemption. Johnny Cash was born on February 26, 1932, in the small town of Kingsland, Arkansas, a place where hard work wasn't a choice, it was survival. His family, like so many others during the Great Depression, struggled to make ends meet. Life wasn't about luxuries, it was about getting through each day. From the moment he was old enough to stand in the cotton fields, he worked alongside his parents and siblings, hands raw from the labor, the sun beating down on his back. But through the endless rows of cotton and the calloused fingers, there was something else: music. His mother, Carrie, had a voice that could turn sorrow into something sacred. She sang gospel hymns to fill their small home with hope, and young Johnny soaked in every note. Even before he could play, he knew that music had power. It could ease pain, lift spirits, and, maybe one day, carry him beyond the endless cycle of poverty. He listened to the radio whenever he could, drawn to the voices of country and gospel singers who seemed to be telling his own story. But just as he began to dream, tragedy struck. His older brother, Jack, was the one person he looked up to most. Hardworking, kind, and deeply religious, Jack was everything Johnny wanted to be. But in 1944, when Johnny was just 12 years old, a horrific accident shattered his world. Jack had been working at a sawmill trying to earn extra money for the family. In a cruel twist of fate, he was pulled into a whirring table saw, suffering injuries so severe that he wouldn't survive. For days, Jack clung to life. But there was nothing the doctors could do. On his deathbed, he told his family he had seen visions of heaven, a moment that haunted Johnny for the rest of his life. He never forgot his brother's last words, nor the deep grief that settled over his family like a shadow. He especially never forgot the pain in his father's eyes, or the way it seemed to harden into something else: disappointment, maybe even resentment. In the years that followed, Johnny found solace where he always had: in music. His mother, recognizing the weight he carried, encouraged him to play guitar. A neighbor helped teach him chords, and before long, Johnny was writing songs of his own. He sang gospel in church, pouring his soul into every word, finding peace in melodies that echoed the ones his mother used to sing. Music wasn't just a hobby. It was a way to survive, to make sense of the grief, to hold on to the memory of Jack and the lessons he had left behind. By the time he was a teenager, Johnny knew that music would be his way out. He might not have had much, but he had a voice, a deep, gravelly sound that carried the weight of the struggles he had already faced. It was raw, honest, and filled with something people couldn't quite put their finger on. Maybe it was pain, maybe it was hope, or maybe it was both. But no matter what, it was his. At 18, Johnny Cash stood at a crossroads. The weight of his brother's death, the struggles of poverty, and the need to find purpose all pushed him towards something bigger than Kingsland, Arkansas. So in 1950, with little hesitation, he enlisted in the U.S. Air Force, trading the fields of his childhood for a military uniform and a ticket to the unknown. The Korean War was raging. But Johnny wasn't sent to the front lines. Instead, he was stationed in Landsberg, West Germany, where he worked as a radio intercept operator, decoding Soviet transmissions in a world that felt a lifetime away from the cotton farms of his youth. The military gave him structure, but it also gave him something else: time to think, time to write, and time to dream of a future beyond duty and discipline. During lonely nights overseas, he wrote letters home, filling pages with the words he couldn't say out loud. But it was during one of his brief trips back to the U.S. that his life changed forever. One evening in San Antonio, Texas, he wandered into a roller skating rink where he locked eyes with a girl who would soon steal his heart. Her name was Vivian Liberto. She was young, beautiful, and full of life in a way that Johnny found mesmerizing. They talked, they laughed, and before the night was over, Johnny knew this was something special. Their romance played out through letters, handwritten promises of a life they would build together once he returned for good. In 1954, after 4 years in the military, Johnny was honorably discharged and wasted no time making good on his word. He married Vivian, and together they moved to Memphis, Tennessee, in search of something more. But dreams didn't pay the bills, and Johnny found himself in a job he hated, selling appliances door to door. Each day, he knocked on strangers' doors, trying to convince them they needed a new refrigerator or washing machine, all the while knowing that the only thing he wanted was to make music. At night, he picked up his guitar, writing songs and playing wherever he could. He connected with local musicians, forming a small group, and set his sights on Sun Records, the label that had launched the careers of Elvis Presley and Carl Perkins. With a heart full of hope and a handful of gospel songs, he walked through the doors of Sun, eager to prove himself. But Sam Phillips, the legendary producer who had built the label from the ground up, wasn't impressed. He listened, then leaned in and told Johnny something that would stay with him forever. "Come back when you've done some sinning." It was a hard truth. Gospel music alone wouldn't get him a record deal. If he wanted to make it, he had to tap into something raw, something real. So Johnny went back, reworked his approach, and returned with something different. Something that spoke to love, temptation, and the struggles of being human. And this time, Phillips listened. In 1955, Johnny Cash released "I Walk the Line," a song that quickly took off, climbing the country and pop charts. It was simple yet powerful, a song about devotion that resonated with listeners across America. Almost overnight, Johnny went from a struggling salesman to a rising star. The music industry had found its next big name, and Johnny had found his way in. But with success came temptation, and with fame came pressure. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy. Johnny Cash had walked the line, but soon he would be dangerously close to crossing it. Success came fast, but so did the consequences. By the late 1950s, Johnny Cash wasn't just a rising star, he was a full-fledged sensation. His deep, unpolished voice carried something different, something raw, and fans couldn't get enough. With every hit song, the crowds grew larger, the demands got bigger, and the man who had once knocked on doors selling appliances was now selling out concert halls across the country. But fame was a weight he wasn't prepared to carry. The long nights on the road, the pressure to perform, and the exhaustion of endless touring started to take their toll. Johnny found a way to keep going: little white pills. Amphetamines promised energy, focus, and the ability to push through exhaustion. But they also brought something darker: paranoia, mood swings, and a growing dependence he didn't yet recognize. In the midst of it all, there was June Carter. She was a star in her own right. born into country music royalty, a performer with a sharp wit and an undeniable stage presence. They met backstage at the Grand Ole Opry in 1956, and from the moment they locked eyes, there was something electric between them. But there was also a problem. Both of them were married. June knew the danger of getting too close. She kept her distance, but it wasn't enough. The more time they spent together, the harder it became to ignore the pull. On stage, their chemistry was undeniable, their duets filled with a passion that audiences could feel. Off stage, the reality was messier. Johnny was a man torn in two, devoted to his wife and children, yet drawn to a woman who seemed to understand him in a way no one else did. Then came Ring of Fire. June always claimed the song came to her in a dream, the words spilling onto paper like a confession she could no longer keep inside. But Vivian, Johnny's wife, had her own interpretation. To her, the song wasn't poetry, it was proof. Proof of the affair she had long suspected. Proof that her husband's heart was no longer hers. As Johnny's love for June intensified, so did his addiction. The amphetamines that once kept him going now controlled him. He needed them to get through the day, to step on stage, to keep up the image of Johnny Cash, the fearless outlaw, even as his personal life was spiraling. His drinking escalated, and his mood swings became more erratic. Waylon Jennings, another country music rebel, became one of Johnny's closest friends during this time. But their friendship was fueled by more than music. It was built on a shared love of the same dangerous habits. The two men encouraged each other's worst impulses, pushing their limits, seeing how far they could go before something broke. And something did break. Vivian watched helplessly as the man she had fallen in love with slipped further and further away. The late nights, the empty promises, the erratic behavior, it was all becoming too much. Their home, once filled with laughter and music, was now filled with tension and silence. Johnny was present in body, but absent in every other way. The double life he had built, loving father by day, reckless outlaw by night, was starting to crumble, and soon he would be forced to face the damage he had done. By 1965, Johnny Cash wasn't just walking the line. He was dangerously close to crossing it. His career was still soaring, but behind the scenes, his life was unraveling. The man who once sang about devotion and faithfulness was now drowning in addiction, pushing every boundary in sight. And then, one reckless moment changed everything. It started with what should have been a peaceful camping trip in California's Los Padres National Forest. Johnny, already deep into his drug habit, took his nephew Damon along for the ride, but what was meant to be an escape into the wilderness turned into a disaster. Under the haze of pills, Johnny set up camp, but at some point, a fire started. The flames spread fast, tearing through dry brush, igniting trees, and turning hundreds of acres into a blazing inferno. The fire raged out of control, consuming 500 acres of land, displacing wildlife and causing irreversible damage. When authorities finally caught up with Johnny, they demanded answers. His response? "I didn't care about the damn buzzards." His flippant attitude only made things worse. The U.S. government came after him, and soon he found himself on the receiving end of a lawsuit, demanding $882,000 in damages, a staggering amount that made it clear just how serious the consequences were. But Johnny wasn't done making headlines. That same year, his addiction led him across the border into Mexico, where he sought out his next fix. He had grown bolder, more reckless, convinced that he was untouchable. But as he returned to the U.S. through El Paso, Texas, authorities were waiting. They pulled him aside, searched his belongings, and uncovered 668 dexedrine and equinyl pills hidden in his guitar case and suitcase. This time, there was no escape. The officers slapped cuffs on Johnny Cash, one of the biggest stars in the world, marching him through the airport in front of flashing cameras. The mugshot that followed was more than just a photograph. It was a symbol of his downfall. There he stood, in dark sunglasses, looking defiant. But the truth was undeniable. Johnny Cash was no longer in control. But the consequences of his arrest stretched far beyond himself. When newspapers published photos of Johnny and Vivian, the media frenzy took a cruel turn. With her dark Sicilian features, Vivian was suddenly the target of racist speculation. White supremacist groups latched onto the image, spreading lies and threats. Letters filled with hatred arrived at their home, and even their young daughters were subjected to taunts and whispers. For Vivian, it was the final blow. She had stood by him through his drinking, his drug use, his disappearances. But this, the public humiliation, the danger to their family, was too much. Johnny had dragged them all into his chaos, and now they were the ones suffering for his mistakes. He had lost control. His career was hanging by a thread, his family was falling apart, and for the first time, Johnny Cash realized he was standing at the edge of something he might not come back from. The man in black had hit rock bottom, and now he had a choice: keep sinking or find a way to climb out. Johnny Cash had spent years teetering on the edge, but by 1967, he was finally free-falling. His marriage was crumbling, his body was breaking down, and the drugs that had once kept him moving were now pulling him under. His reckless behavior had left him isolated, a shadow of the man who once sang about walking the line. But in the midst of his self-destruction, there was one person who refused to let him disappear completely: June Carter. June had seen the worst of Johnny, and yet she never turned away. She knew the chaos he carried, the demons that haunted him, and the addictions that ruled his life. But she also knew the man beneath it all, the one who still had a chance to be saved. So, with the help of her family, she made a decision. Johnny wasn't going to do this alone anymore. In early 1968, June and her family staged an intervention. They moved into Johnny's home in Tennessee, surrounding him with something he had long since abandoned: stability. They took away his pills, forced him to face the withdrawal, and stayed by his side as he fought through the sickness and pain. And for the first time in years, Johnny saw a glimpse of the life he could have. The one that didn't involve waking up in a haze of regret. And then, in February of that same year, something happened that would change his life forever. He and June were performing together in London, Ontario, standing under the stage lights as they had so many times before. But this time was different. In front of a packed crowd, Johnny stopped mid-show, turned to June, and asked the question that had been hanging between them for years: "Will you marry me?" The audience erupted, but June didn't answer right away. She had spent years watching Johnny destroy himself. She loved him, but she wasn't going to agree unless she believed he was ready. Johnny wasn't a man who begged, but in that moment, he did. He told her he couldn't live without her, that he needed her. And finally, after what felt like an eternity, she said yes. A few weeks later, they married in a small, private ceremony in Kentucky. It should have been the beginning of a clean slate, a fresh start. And in some ways, it was. With June by his side, Johnny fought to get sober, determined to leave behind the life that had nearly destroyed him. But addiction isn't something that disappears overnight. The same demons that had followed him for years weren't so easily silenced. Even as he built a new life with June, even as he became a father to their son, John Carter Cash, the cravings lingered. The birth of their son in 1970 gave Johnny a new purpose. He wanted to be better, to be present, to be the kind of father he wished his own had been. And for a while, he was. He stayed clean, focused on his family, and found peace in the love that he and June had fought so hard for. But addiction is relentless. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, Johnny's sobriety was a battle that never truly ended. He would go months, even years, without touching a pill, only to fall back into the same old patterns: rehab, relapse, repeat. It became a cycle, one that June knew all too well. But no matter how many times he stumbled, she was always there to pick him up. Johnny Cash had spent a lifetime searching for love, for peace, for redemption. And though his struggles never fully disappeared, one thing was certain: June Carter was the light that had pulled him out of the darkness. By the late 1960s, Johnny Cash had seen the inside of a jail cell more times than he cared to admit. He had been arrested for drugs, drunkenness, and reckless behavior, but he had never served a real prison sentence. And yet, no one in country music embodied the outlaw spirit more than he did. It wasn't just the way he sang, it was the way he carried himself. He understood struggle, pain, and regret. He had lived it. And that's why, when he stood on stage in front of the inmates at Folsom Prison in 1968, they believed every word he sang. The prison was cold, the air thick with tension, but as soon as Johnny walked on stage in his black suit, the room shifted. The inmates, men who had been cast aside by society, suddenly had someone standing in front of them who saw them, not just their crimes. He wasn't just a performer that day, he was one of them. From the moment he hit the first note of Folsom Prison Blues, the audience erupted. He wasn't sugarcoating their reality. He wasn't giving them sympathy. He was giving them truth. A song about a man who made a mistake, about regret and the weight of choices that can never be undone. And they hung on every word. The album At Folsom Prison became a defining moment of Johnny's career, proving that his music didn't just speak to the broken, it belonged to them. It was raw, gritty, and unapologetic. It was the sound of a man who understood what it meant to lose everything. 1 year later, he did it again. This time at San Quentin, where he stood before an even tougher crowd. Men who had committed the worst crimes, locked away in a prison with no mercy. And yet, when Johnny sang, he had them in the palm of his hand. He gave them something they hadn't had in years: freedom, even if only for a song. That night, he debuted San Quentin, a song so defiant, so bold, that the prisoners nearly rioted. It was dangerous, it was thrilling, and it was exactly the kind of moment that would cement Johnny Cash's outlaw legend forever. The irony, of course, was that Johnny had never been a true outlaw. He had never robbed a bank, never pulled a gun, never done hard time behind bars. But that didn't matter. What mattered was that he understood the feeling of being trapped by addiction, by regret, by the weight of choices that couldn't be undone. And that's why the world believed him. Johnny Cash didn't have to live inside a prison to know what it was like to be a prisoner. By the late 1980s, the music industry had moved on. The rebel who once dominated the charts now found himself out of place, struggling to connect with a younger audience. Johnny Cash, the man who had once been untouchable, was suddenly facing rejection. And then came the final blow. Columbia Records dropped him. The label that had once built his career now saw him as a relic of the past, a legend whose time had come and gone. For the first time, Johnny was forced to confront a painful truth. He was being forgotten. The radio stations no longer played his songs. The big stages that once welcomed him were giving their spotlight to new names. And the very industry that had once embraced his defiant spirit now saw him as irrelevant. But Johnny Cash wasn't done. In 1993, at a time when most had written him off, a man named Rick Rubin came knocking. A producer known for working with rock and hip-hop artists, Rubin saw something no one else did. A man whose voice still had power, whose story still mattered. He didn't want Johnny Cash, the country star. He wanted Johnny Cash, the man. Rubin invited Johnny to his home, handed him a guitar, and told him to just play. No fancy production, no backing band, just his voice and the truth. And that's how American Recordings was born. Stripped down, hauntingly raw, it was an album that reintroduced Johnny to the world, not as a fading legend, but as an artist still at his peak. The critics praised it. The fans rediscovered him. Suddenly, Johnny Cash was relevant again. Not because he had changed, but because he had finally been given the space to be his most authentic self. But it was in 2002 that Johnny delivered his final, most haunting masterpiece. Rubin suggested a song, one that had never been written for him, but somehow felt like it had always belonged to him, Hurt. When Johnny recorded it, his voice was weaker, worn by age and illness, but the emotion was more powerful than ever. And when the music video was released, the world stopped. There he was, an old man, frail, sitting alone at his piano, surrounded by flickering images of his past. The once unbreakable outlaw now looked broken, vulnerable, human. The video wasn't just a song, it was a goodbye. And in the months that followed, his world crumbled. In May 2003, June Carter passed away. And for Johnny, it was as if the last light in his life had gone out. He had lost his anchor, his muse, his reason to keep going. The man who had spent decades fighting to survive no longer had the strength to keep fighting. 4 months later, on September 12, 2003, Johnny Cash took his final breath. But his story didn't end there. Because the world didn't forget him after all. The music, the pain, the truth he poured into every song, it lived on. And in the end, Johnny Cash got the only kind of redemption that truly mattered. His voice would never fade. Johnny Cash was a man of contradictions, a sinner and a believer, a devoted husband and a restless heart, a voice for the broken, yet a man who broke others. He stood for justice, yet made reckless choices. He sang about redemption, yet spent a lifetime chasing it. His story wasn't clean, and it wasn't simple, but that's what made it real. Through all the highs and lows, his music never wavered. It carried the weight of his struggles, the truth of his failures, and the hope of a man who never stopped searching for something greater. Johnny Cash wasn't perfect, but maybe that's why his legacy still resonates today. So, what do you think? Was Johnny Cash a man redeemed, or was his darkness too deep to escape? Let us know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more deep dives into music's most legendary figures.